I'm Michael Scadden. I'm here with the Consul General, Jose Antonio Zabalgoitia, here in Miami. He's heading to Washington, D.C. soon, but I figured we'd take the opportunity to sit down with him and ask him a few questions. He recently gave a presentation over at Florida International University, which was particularly good in my opinion. He made some great points. Again, I'm Michael Scadden. I like to explore the intersection of politics, economics, and security in Latin America. And this was a perfect opportunity to do so with someone who's an expert in a number of those areas. And he can help us clarify some of what we may think we know about the U.S.-Mexico relationship in terms of trade and security, as well as a number of other areas, immigration policy, things like that. So,
nice to be here, Michael.
It's nice to be here with you. So you did recently give that presentation that I mentioned at FIU. And you mentioned how Mexico is a strategic U.S. partner.
It is. Mexico is probably one of the top 3 to top 5 relationships for the United States globally. We are the southern neighbor of the United States. We are the gateway to the Western Hemisphere, to Latin America. And along with Canada, we are partners with the United States in a trading bloc and in an economic bloc that is the North American region that keeps us competitive, for the three countries, in a global competition for gaining markets and being more productive and more profitable. So we found a good relation with the United States, and we are convinced that the 3 countries in North America, Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., benefit from this relationship.
Okay, I believe that's true. So we're going to get into why that is true.
Sure.
Absolutely. So Jess, can you give us like a 2-minute history on NAFTA?
Right. The first, the most remote predecessor of NAFTA was back in the 1980s, early 80s. The U.S. approached Mexico to sign a free trade agreement. And at the time, Mexico was very suspicious of the United States. We thought that the U.S. wanted to get Mexico's energy. So, and we had at that time a state monopoly on our energy. It is one of the pillars of our nationalism, and for historical reasons. And we rejected that proposal. But then, 6-7 years later, a couple of things happened. The government in Mexico changed. We had tough economic times during the 80s. We were indebted. Oil prices went down. So we were in trouble. And we decided that we had to change our economy. State enterprises were privatized. And we turned to being a more market-oriented economy. And at that time, the U.S. signed the free trade agreement with Canada, the bilateral free trade agreement with Canada in 1987, something like that. And we joined the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, starting to open up our economy in 1986. The GATT was the predecessor to the World Trade Organization. So we basically joined the world economic flows at that time, and just the timing was perfect. The U.S. was signing a free trade agreement with Canada, Mexico was opening up, so we asked Canada and the U.S. to let us come in, and they agreed. There was quite a serious battle to convince people in the 3 countries that this was a good idea. But 20 years later, we find that the 3 countries have benefited enormously from that trade negotiation. We trade, the U.S., for example, buys from Canada and Mexico, the other way around. Mexico and Canada together buy 1/3 of the exports of the United States.
1/3.
So that is the NAFTA market for the U.S. Just to give one single statistic as an example of what has happened in those 20 years of NAFTA activity.
Well, that is one pretty substantial statistic. which kind of follows into, you mentioned in your presentation that the U.S. jobs that depend directly on trade with Mexico are somewhere in the number of 6 million.
That's correct.
So not only are you guys buying one-third of what we create.
Let me give you a couple of two more statistics. The first one is that 35% of U.S. export that is bought from NAFTA partners, is the breakdown is Canada 19%, Mexico 16%. When you translate those purchases into jobs in the U.S., you have 9 million jobs for Canada trade and 6 million jobs for Mexico trade. In the U.S., that's 15 million. And also, from exports of Mexico to the U.S. have a 40% component of U.S. Inputs. So for every dollar that Mexico is selling to the U.S., it has previously bought 40 cents of U.S. exports.
Wow.
So if you compare that rate to the one that China has, China only has a 4% content of every dollar that it exports to the United States. So for the U.S., trading with Mexico is really, really positive, whilst when other partners...
Basically making money off of this supply chain that we have with Mexico.
Basically what we have is economic integration. Economic integration that has made the North American region an economic bloc that is competitive globally. It has benefited the three of us. Many industries in the U.S. are still profitable and are still in existence and still competing in the global market because they have been able to shift production to Canada or Mexico of some parts of the whole final product. When you find something made in Mexico, let's say a car, when a car comes out of a plant in Toronto, in Detroit, or in Hermosillo, Mexico, it is not Canadian or US or Mexican, it is North American, it is NAFTA. That car, at some point in its production chain,
or at multiple points,
has crossed 8 times the two borders. It's advantage in that regard because we are close to each other. We have roads that are integrated. We have railways that are integrated, and that gives us, as a region, as a North American region, an enormous competitive globally, because we can produce just in time, we can manage stocks, we can decide which parts of the chain of production go to each country according to comparative advantages between the three countries. And it's not only labor, it can be energy, it can be energy cost, or it can be proximity to export
well, going back to your point specifically on just in time, I mean, for JIT, for those that don't know, just in time is essential to some companies, especially now. You know, I mean, you have these global giants that are growing, such as Amazon, Walmart, with online purchases, especially. You're getting to the point now where that just in time component is absolutely essential.
Yes, because
and you can't have that when you're crossing oceans.
It allows you to reduce the stock. And remember, for
which
people
reduces
that
costs.
If you have a huge stock, you have capital that is not producing. It's just sitting there in the stock room.
Right.
So just in time allows you to reduce that capital and get the more out of your working capital.
And obviously we can do that much easier with Mexico and obviously Canada than we can with pretty much any other two nations in the world. Let's go real quick here. You mentioned Mexico has been highly profitable for a highly profitable market for U.S. companies. So how many companies are operating in Mexico directly? You know, how much foreign direct investment is down there? How much do we basically have to lose if we continue any trends towards deteriorating relations? Which we don't necessarily see that happening, but if that were the case, what do we stand to lose there as far as foreign direct investment within Mexico? Aside from...
I would say that almost any global company, probably a few are not, but almost any U.S. global company has some sort of production or value chain situated in the Mexican economy. That is the degree of integration that we have achieved by means of NAFTA between the three countries. And we can also see that there's a very clear correlation between Canadian investment in Mexico to the origin of NAFTA. Before NAFTA, investments of Canadian companies in Mexico was non-significant. But the most impressive thing is that now you have Mexican companies investing and creating jobs directly in the United States and in Canada.
That was the next
and
question.
In important sectors. So it is basically an integration exercise that has included two developed countries with a developing country that has proven successful. So I think that we should be working, and we're talking to the US, in working towards improving NAFTA, making NAFTA, getting us to be even more competitive than we have been so far.
Right.
Then for 32, we are on the top 3. And for 40, we are on the top 5.
Okay.
Florida is not there. But anyway, still, we trade with Florida about the same thing that we trade with the United Kingdom, which is one of the 7 largest economies in the world.
Well, I mean, let me bring it up.
So
Florida,
one of the lesser trading partners, which is Florida, which trades a lot more with Brazil or with Venezuela or with other Latin American countries, even with Florida, we are a huge partner. We trade as much as Mexico trades with the United Kingdom.
Well, the connection is for our audience, but again, try to send your questions as soon as you can. We're just going to cover like 2 more little topics, and we could go with kind of a lightning round, the 1-minute answer.
Okay. Good.
What do you want to tell the audience basically about international labor markets? And I like using that term more than any other that I've heard, whether it's undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants. I like that term that you use, international labor market, because this is something that we are exquisitely reliant on. Not to mention, we're talking about 11 million people that produce in the U.S. That's 11 million people's worth of economic activity that we have to take into consideration. And how many of those are Mexican citizens?
What I like to say is that, first, of those 11 million people that you mentioned, not all are Mexican.
Right.
But a significant number is Mexican. But Mexicans come over here because between Mexico and the U.S., we need to acknowledge that there is an international labor market operating since decades ago. There is labor demand in the U.S. for certain areas and certain unskilled jobs, or particularly skilled jobs that do not exist in the U.S. The amount of labor force to perform them, like agricultural work, for example, which is to an extent is skilled labor, because you need to know how to pick up tomatoes, or how to pick up oranges. It is not just like going and...
I remember picking blueberries as a kid, and it was
difficult.
Excruciating.
It is exhausting. So we have this international labor market between the two countries working out for decades. When a Mexican comes over here, it usually comes over here because there is a job for him, waiting for him, and a job that he is trained to do.
You mentioned that before, that usually by the time
people from one community in Mexico are with people of the same community in the U.S. So you have a correlation between local towns in the U.S. and in Mexico. And that proves that the point. Also, Mexicans used to come and go. They came over here, went back to Mexico for Christmas. Harvest time in the U.S., came back to where the job was needed. Finished the harvest, went back to Mexico. But then a fence was built, and that was counterproductive, because that increased the costs to getting to the harvest market, to the harvest job. It made necessary to
increase the risks overall.
Increase the risk, and it made necessary to rely on a criminal organization of human traffickers, which also increased the prices, brought corruption on both sides of the border. Finally, it didn't stop the people from coming. It just made it more expensive.
And it also made it more difficult to go back.
Exactly. It made it impossible to go back, because if you paid thousands of dollars to get to the job, then you cannot do that every year. So you stayed.
Right.
And that happens to Central Americans a lot. And that's why we see that Central Americans are getting their children over to join them here in the United States, again, paying for that service to criminal organizations. So the fence was a terribly bad idea.
Yeah. Well, and I think in recent years, a lot of statistics are showing that there's a net outflow of...
That is another factor that shows that Mexico is doing well. It's doing better than before. And Mexicans are getting more opportunities in their own country, so they don't want to pay the high prices and incurring the risks of coming to get to perform a job in the U.S. We have, since 2014, a net outflow of Mexicans from the U.S. So there are more Mexicans coming back to Mexico than those that are coming to the U.S. to find a job. So that I think that it is a statistic that it is showing that Mexico is doing better, and Mexico is starting to provide better opportunities for their citizens.
Absolutely. What would you say, going off on that topic a little bit, what are the entrepreneurship opportunities for someone going back from the U.S., let's say whether they're a seasonal worker or a DACA individual, someone on the DACA program? Because I remember you said, if they must come back, then bring them all. They're more than welcome. I mean, that's skills.
If you look at, it is hard to speak of this issue because there are human costs, and people have feelings, no? And you have broken families and things that are terrible. But the way I see it is that those Mexicans that are coming back, they are coming back changed. First of all, they are coming back to a different country than the one they left. Second, to a more open economy in the country, to more opportunities, to better chances to thrive. Second, when they are coming back with a different education in terms of how to develop in the labor market or in the entrepreneurial market. How they probably went without knowing how to run a company or how to run a store, but when they come back, they will have that knowledge with them, and they will just inject it into the Mexican economy, and that will make us improve the way our
bringing money
works.
And skills, and in some
from
cases,
the bottom
education.
Up, from the bottom up, not from the top to the bottom. And let's take the example of a dreamer boy or girl. If they must come back to Mexico, think of it this way: they left they left as small children. Their parents probably didn't have a college education. When they come back with a college education, speaking 2 languages, understanding the U.S. culture, getting to an economy that is interlocked, that it is thriving in its interaction with the U.S., they will be very valuable for any Mexican or U.S. company to work for them in Mexico. So they will have a lot more chances to thrive in Mexico.
Absolutely.
Than probably here.
And I think as an American, I don't want to see them leave like that.
Neither myself, because neither myself. But if they do take the decision, I think that they will do well in Mexico, and I think that they should look at it this way. Also, and not just looking at it like with the human cost and the sadness of leaving the place where they grew up.
Absolutely.
Which I think is undeniable, and I think in our duty is to really try to help them out to stay if they can.
Absolutely.
Or if they wish.
And they should. I mean, if we're looking at it from a selfish perspective on the American side, it's like we would be giving up all those skills. We'd be giving up all those skills and all that insight that could be useful on both sides of the border.
It is bringing back talent, educated people, and entrepreneurship.
Absolutely.
And again,
and there are opportunities for entrepreneurship.
Of course.
I mean, Mexico City is growing at an exponential rate. I mean, by 2030, I can't remember how many millions are going to be over the $15,000 a year mark. And I mean, you're talking about a burgeoning upper middle class. a group of consumers, that need businesses or will start their own businesses. Anyway, that's another topic we can get into. One thing that I really want to touch on, something that I don't think anybody has brought up in terms of immigration, is what I like to call the informal export economy. You have people that come here, legally or illegally, and every time they go home on a plane, or every time they send anything back home, whether it's a few big boxes or a couple of duffel bags, those are American products that they're sending back that aren't necessarily on any export register. So, even though we can't necessarily measure that or get an exact number of what that is, to me that's another part of the American economy that's being exported abroad through these informal channels. These are people that are buying our products in these stores, sending them back home to resell, for whatever purpose they have, whether it's a bag of clothes, a box of shoes, as it were. They're sending it back to, let's say grandma and grandpa's shop in, DFA or in Bogota. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Very quickly, those are, you're right, are unaccountable or unaccounted for exports by the U.S. to Mexico. And they are not negligible, and they make a huge impact on local life in Mexico, because people left from usually poor communities or not as well-to-do communities in Mexico come to the U.S., and those that can go back, probably there are about 1 million people that every Christmas time make the trip back to Mexico to visit their families. And as you say, they pack their trucks, they pack everything they can, as much as they can, to bring it back to Mexico. And we do something to facilitate that. We increase the customs allowance for families crossing by land to Mexico, and during that time of the year. And we also provide them with assistance on the road and directions to make the trip easier for them, because it is sometimes a long trip. Absolutely. And that those goods that come from their families in the U.S. to their places of origin in Mexico, they go directly to those communities that need them most. So it is not only an unaccounted export by the U.S. through the Mexican community back to Mexico, but it is also an unaccounted for injection of goods to the Mexicans that need them most, that are more the neediest portion of the population in some cases.
I guess I have to wonder, and again, I don't necessarily have any way to measure this, or maybe, but some of the towns where they're buying these goods before they take them home are probably seeing at least some increase in the sales that they have because of this, right? I mean,
it's very likely, because they are rural workers, so they won't be buying in New York's Fifth Avenue. They won't be buying in their local mom and pop stores in Main Street, which also again provides a local positive economic impact on this country, in the U.S.
Creates jobs as well as sales. Let's see, can we get 2 more minutes and then we'll go to questions?
Let's go to questions.
Let's go to questions. All right. Do we have any questions?
Not yet.
Not yet?
No.
Okay, so one more.
One more
here, and then
all right.
We'll wrap it up.
We were going to get into joint security. Can you talk about that for 30 seconds, and I want to get to one big question.
Again,
joint security operations between Mexico and the U.S. Obviously, there's a lot in the news as far as the drug trade and other, as you mentioned, human trafficking before. Just 30 seconds, how are the U.S. and Mexico approaching those issues together?
From a very long time, Mexico and the U.S. have understood that international criminal organizations do not acknowledge borders. They operate internationally and now globally, and that is an international phenomenon, and no country can just fight it on its own individually. You need international cooperation to fight transnational organized crime. That's a fact, and that's uncontestable.
Absolutely, especially since I think in many ways we're the consumers of that transnational crime. Now, here's a big one, if you can speak to this at all. Depending on how U.S. relations with Mexico move forward in the future, what's the outlook for relations with China now? A lot of people are saying that the Chinese seem very willing to fill any vacuum that is left by the U.S. in terms of its trade or its economic activity or even its security activities with Mexico, some of our biggest allies in the region, in Colombia and Peru and even Chile. Can you speak to that at all?
No, very broadly. What I would stress out is that Mexico is currently one of the most open economies in the world. We have, I think it's 14 free trade agreements, and that gets us to probably 1.5 billion consumers worldwide on free trade agreements. So as an open economy, we don't consider NAFTA or North America our only market. We have a free trade agreement with the European Union. We have a free trade agreement with Japan, which is the second largest economy in the world right now. We were part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we signed that, and it is still alive for us. So we are members of the Alliance of the Pacific, which is the most successful integration exercise in Latin America. In only 2 years, we were able to go from 0 to 0 tariffs between Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. So it is a great success in that sense. And we have a very large trade relationship with China. Unfortunately, it is unbalanced. But I think that there is huge potential to have a more balanced trade with China as well. So we don't discard ourselves as because we acknowledge ourselves as a global free trade country. We are the 8th largest manufacturing and exporting country in the world, and we are only the 15th largest economy. So we are punching above our weight in trade. So we.
Right. Well, if you didn't ask your questions yet, you're not going to get to ask them for now. If anyone does have questions, I'll see if I can follow up with Andres and the Consul General. And when are you going to DC?
Probably at the end of this month. So.
And then you're permanently stationed there?
That's my next posting.
Okay.
We'll be working there at the embassy, so
awesome.
We're excited.
What's your main role going to be there?
I'm going to be the Deputy Chief of Mission, which is the second in command after Ambassador Jerónimo Gutiérrez.
Okay.
And I'm going to be overlooking the political relations.
And that's going to be a lot of fun, I can imagine.
It's a challenge, and it's a challenge, and
it's a fun challenge.
When you have opportunities and you take a good advantage of those opportunities, everybody wins.
Absolutely.
That's what we will be working for.
I think that's the key thing you said there, and taking advantage of those opportunities together, that everybody wins. Anyway, thank you for joining us, or thank you for viewing this later. And again, thank you, Consul General.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all.
I appreciate it. Thank you to Andres. Goodbye.